During the mass extinction event of the 1930s and 40s, scientists in New Zealand devised a secret plan to create a tsunami device capable of flooding coastal cities and incapacitating enemies. The project started after U.S. Navy officer E.A. Gibson noticed small waves generated by explosions used to clear coral reefs, and the idea was developed by the United States and New Zealand military in a program code named Project SEAL. Now, the weapons concept was deemed feasible, but the weapons themselves were never fully developed or used. A related concept, the bouncing device, was developed and used in the Yahtzee years to be dropped into water as a means to destroy dams and cause loss of industrial capacity and widespread flooding. So sure, while the thing technically never got made, the research from this project actually led to the devastating explosives we know today. Human experimentation by Japanese Unit 731 during that same time period, committed primarily against innocent civilians, was a thing. Now, there's not enough time today to list the half of it, but here's an idea. Dissection of living humans, pregnant folks, usually without anesthesia, and usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and so forth and so on. Horror movie level surgeries involving cutting off limbs and reattaching them to the wrong sides of a victim, removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without them to see what would happen. Like, this was inhumane. We can't forget that these victims were routinely tormented just for the fun of it, even without flimsy excuses like science. This makes other folks look like misunderstood humanitarians. The victim count was in the thousands upon thousands. These were innocent people, or they were prisoners. They were folks that didn't deserve it. The icing on the cake, General MacArthur and the rest of the US government found out about it when they captured Japan, and they granted Unit 731 immunity for their crimes so long as they shared their findings with America and only America. Many of the unit members went on to have very successful and profitable futures after this. There was nothing 1950s and 60s America loved more than dropping big nuclear devices and watching them go kaboom. But in these early days of nuclear weaponry, we still didn't really know the effects that these tests had on the human body. So Project Sunshine was a series of research studies that began in 1953 to figure out the impact of radioactive fallout on the world's population. This thing sought to examine the long-term effects of nuclear radiation on the biosphere due to repeated nuclear detonations of increasing yields. Particularly, they were like, hey, let's check out the tissue from young people, because their developing bones have the highest propensity to accumulate all of this, and therefore the highest susceptibility to damage. So it was in this environment that scientists at the Sunshine Conference, ergo the name, they argued in favor of sampling human samples, for lack of a better word. In 1955, there was a meeting of the Atomic Energy Commission, which came up with some of the specifics of the testing and urged researchers to use their own contacts to discreetly get a hold of tissue and bone samples, also not getting permission of the deceased. Literally, there's a direct quote saying, "Human samples are of prime importance, and if anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country." Well, about 6,000 corpses from 26 bone collection sites around the world were shipped under top secret conditions to the project's headquarters in Chicago and to other research facilities. In the 13th century, Genghis Khan killed so many peasants that the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. So during his 20-year reign, Genghis Khan's destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of like 40 million people. While his intentions for the mass killings were anything but pure, with nobody left to farm the lands owned by the peasants, they were eventually allowed to grow back into carbon-absorbing forests. It's estimated that 700 million tons of carbon were wiped from the atmosphere, which is about the same amount of carbon dioxide generated in a year through global petrol consumption. Back in 897 AD, the Catholic Church put a dead man on trial, known as the Cadaver Synod. The posthumous trial of Pope Formosus was held by Pope Stephen VI, his successor. So Pope Formosus was accused of doing bad things with the papacy, even though he was like dead for 7 months by the point he was accused. So the body of the Pope was exhumed, dressed in papal attire, and brought to the court for judgment. And they even appointed a deacon to speak on behalf of the dead Pope. But he was found guilty, all his acts as Pope were declared null and void, his body was stripped of the garments and dressed in rags, his 3 fingers of benediction were cut off, and his body cast into the river Tiber, where ancient Romans disposed of their infamous criminals for centuries. But once again, like, he was dead, so it's kind of all just for show and theater. So I grew up visiting the Museum of Northern History, home of Sir Harry Oakes, and he's got quite the mysterious tale. Sir Harry earned his fortune in Canada and moved to the Bahamas in 1930s for tax purposes. Going back to when he moved to Canada, he arrived in Kirkland Lake, which is a tiny little town in northeastern Ontario, on June 19th of 1911, and in September of that same year, he registered the transfer of claim T1663 and established the Lakeshore Mine. 20 years later, the gold mine was the most productive in the Western Hemisphere. Well, on the evening of July 8th, 1943, while living in the Bahamas, shortly after midnight, Harry had his life brutally ended. He was struck 4 times behind the left ear with a miner's handpick to disguise the wounds from a silver ice pick, and then was burned all over his body using insecticide, with the flames being concentrated around the eyes. His body was then sprinkled with feathers from a mattress. When he was discovered, the feathers were still being gently blown over his body by the bedroom fan. So the Bahamas governor, the Duke of Windsor, who had become a close friend of Harry's during the previous 3 years, took charge of the investigation from the get-go, inviting 2 American policemen he knew from Miami to take over the case instead of locals. Well, the 2 American policemen had conveniently forgotten their fingerprint kits, but hey, the local police force had those kits available, so cool. By the evening of day 2 of the investigation, 36 hours after the body was discovered, they had arrested the son-in-law, Count Alfred de Marigny. Count Alfred was on really bad terms with Sir Harry. Why? Well, he was a bit of a playboy, he didn't really have a meaningful career. Also, before he married Nancy, Harry's daughter, he had been married twice for short periods to wealthy women. So Alfred was acquitted in a trial that lasted several weeks. Why? Well, the detectives were suspected of fabricating evidence against him. The chief piece of evidence was a fingerprint. One of the officers was like, oh yeah, we found this in Oakes' bedroom where the body was. Nope, that's a big freaking lie. Later it was discovered that the print had been lifted from the water glass that Alfred had used during his questioning by the police captains. So, the mystery here? Who killed Sir Harry Oakes? Well, the theories that have emerged since 1943 have ranged from a killer reappearing from Oakes' Canadian past, rage-filled secret lover, and my favorite theory, and the one that I believe the most, hitman sent by mobster Meyer Lansky. Make of that what you will, folks. In the 18th century, a woman actually convinced doctors that she was giving birth to rabbits. Reportedly, Mary Toff gave birth to 9 of the fluffy creatures at a time. Doctors were convinced that she was telling the truth until they found pieces of corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits, proving that like it hadn't developed inside her womb. Turns out she was manually inserting the rabbits to make the delivery look as realistic as possible. Ew! In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Western world was desperate to see the primitive people described by explorers and adventurers that were scouting out new lands for colonial exploitation. To feed the frenzy, thousands of indigenous individuals from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were brought to the United States and Europe, more often than not under dubious circumstances, to be put on display in quasi-captive human zoos. One photo that really stood out to me was of the Filipino zoo girl who was on display at the Coney Island Zoo in 1914. This exhibit, known as The World in Miniature, was located in Luna Park, and this poor girl was bound by ropes as people tossed peanuts at her. Most folks have no idea that these zoos existed, but they are definitely a dark part of history. And what's crazier still is that there are still some that have popped up in the 21st century, although not as cruel as they used to be. Ever hear of the Great Molasses Flood? In 1919, a peculiar disaster struck the streets of Boston. A massive wave of molasses, a large storage tank filled with 2.3 million US gallons of molasses burst. And the results? Well, we had a whole wave of molasses rushing through the street at about 35 miles per hour, killing 21 people and injuring about 150. The event entered local folklore, and residents reported for decades afterwards that the area still smelled of molasses on hot summer days. Also, if you've ever seen molasses move, if it's moving that fast, get out of there. 43 people lost their lives in the deadliest accident to ever take place on the London Underground in 1975. On the morning of February 28th, a train carrying about 300 passengers approached Moorgate station, but it didn't slow down. It was traveling around 30 to 40 miles per hour, and one Leslie Newsom was at the controls. At about 8:46 a.m., the 6-car train slammed into the overrun tunnel, which was a dead end. An investigation later revealed that the brakes had not been applied, and Newsom, in the front of the train, made no move to stop the collision. So the first 2 cars, and most of the third, were crushed upon impact. The station went so dark, according to survivor Javier Gonzalez. When emergency personnel arrived, they reportedly found a carriage half the platform and half into the tunnel, but on a slant up into the ceiling. In one doorway there was a row of businessmen, some still with their briefcases, standing as they would have been, waiting for the train to stop, but all dead. Emergency workers spent like 6 days looking for survivors, and while the crash was eventually attributed entirely in the behavior of Newsom during the final minute before the accident occurred, no motive or reason was ever found. And that's all for today, folks. I've been Alexa. See ya!